The Library of Consciousness, Exploring Evolutionary Epistemology, written by Andrea Diem Lane and David Lane. Narrated by Jason Zenobia. Cerebral Mirage. If one really believes in the infinite, one has entered into a realm of mystery where intelligence soon becomes a trespasser. In any acceptance of infinite mystery, a certain agnosticism is inherent. Robert Sencourt. One of the most significant discoveries of modern science is that the world we perceive around us is not as it appears. Rather, neuroscience, evolutionary biology, and quantum physics have demonstrated that our day-to-day reality is a relative construct, built upon a scaffolding of information bits that betray their real origin and causation. For instance, the other day I remarked to my oldest son, Sean, that the ocean water around Catalina Island looked exceptionally blue. But, given his deep knowledge of science, my son responded that such blueness was actually not in the water at all, but how different light waves get absorbed and refracted. The colors we see are due to the spectral properties of light. The longer wavelengths of light, such as red, orange, and yellow, are more readily captured by H2O, whereas the shorter wavelengths of light, such as blue, get refracted, and thus we see the color blue, particularly if the water is clear. But the scientific explanation for why an ocean is blue or a sunset is red is precisely not how we tend to experience such at first glance. In other words, the way we apprehend the world around us is not necessarily how we later comprehend it through scientific analysis. And herein lies the great divide, the great deception, or what early Indian rishis insightfully called Maya. We live in a magic land, where all that manifests and appears real and certain is anything but. Yet, the idea that the world is an illusion is not a new insight or the exclusive discovery of modern science, but actually dates back to the beginning of human civilization. Ancient seers in India and Greece and the Middle East wrote extensively about nature's inherent trickery. Plato's allegory of the cave is perhaps the most illustrative example of how the world of shadows conceals man's real contextual situation, as Plato explained through the mouthpiece of his teacher, Socrates. And now I said, let me show in a figure how far our nature is enlightened or unenlightened. Behold, human beings living in an underground den, which has a mouth open towards the light and reaching all along the den. Here they have been from their childhood, and have their legs and necks chained so that they cannot move, and can only see before them, being prevented by the chains from turning round their heads. Above and behind them a fire is blazing at a distance, and between the fire and the prisoners there is a raised way. And you will see, if you look, a low wall built along the way, like the screen which marionette players have in front of them, over which they show the puppets. And do you see, I said, men passing along the wall, carrying all sorts of vessels and statues and figures of animals made of wood and stone and various materials, which appear over the wall. Some of them are talking, others silent. Thus, the prisoners see only shadows cast by images of real things, not even shadows cast by real things themselves. In India, Vedantists, particularly those of the Advaita persuasion, have argued that the world of appearance is a beguiling illusion which hides the truth of the universe's real essence, and as such it is akin to the curtain in the movie version of The Wizard of Oz, where a balloonist from Kansas plays out his antics in order to gain power and respect, which deceives by hiding that which is behind it. Likewise, in early schools of Gnosticism, they saw the world as the manifestation of a demiurge that entraps all who succumb to its tempting guises. The higher truth is lost because one believes that the image to be real, whereas it is merely a secondary power. What early philosophers and mystics understood, even if they couldn't articulate it scientifically, was that humankind was under the spell of a cerebral mirage, one that gave a false sense of knowledge and certainty. Although religious thinkers of differing persuasions drew out most of these ancient insights, it has turned out to be remarkably prescient in light of modern science. Interestingly, our advanced technology provides us with a very apt metaphor for how the world of our senses belies what lies underneath. Take a current smartphone, such as an iPhone 6, and almost all of us simply stay at the level of its user interface. We tap and swipe at the screen, opening up a vast array of applications that lead us into a wonderland of Angry Birds, Doodle Buddies, Facebook, Instagram, Flipboard, ad infinitum. And in each of these little islands of entertainment we become enveloped into virtual worlds, never pausing to reflect that it is all being engineered at a much deeper level behind the screen by software programmers using computer languages such as Objective-C and Cocoa Java. The user interface is, to invoke Plato's allegory, our cave, and we don't even know we are prisoners to the operating system, which unwittingly constrains our movements in a pre-designed template. Aldis Huxley prophesied in the 1930s in Brave New World how we would be enslaved by a variety of amusements. Similarly, the app entraps us by giving us an illusory sense of latitude. As Zadie Smith rightly opined when analyzing the lure of Facebook worldwide, we enjoy the fruits of a social network without realizing that we are not living out our own dreams, but we live within one engineered by a 20-year something named Mark Zuckerberg. But even the programmers themselves are constrained within the languages they use, which are usually pre-given before they employ them. I remember learning Unix at UCSD back in 1984 and feeling a euphoric sense of freedom, since it freed me from the mechanical boundaries of a Selectric typewriter. But then, as I became more proficient in using the language, I confronted its own limitations and realized anew that I was also bounded within another preset coding system. Even when programming, we sometimes forget that all we are really doing is manipulating a binary system of noughts and ones, which is the fundamental basis of all computation, brilliantly articulated by Alan Turing back in 1936 in his famous paper On Computable Numbers. And binary coding is geometrically portioned within silicon chips, guided and controlled by the transference of electrons from one signal point to another. What we are witnessing, interestingly, is a nested hierarchy. Hardware, software, programming, user interface, etc. But for most of us, we know little if nothing besides the smartphone's display screen. This is true whether we are using Amazon's Kindle Fire, Microsoft's Surface, Google's Chromebooks, or Apple's latest iteration of the iPad. We are surface surfers in the techno world, and we remain dutifully oblivious of all the subterranean caverns that lurk within. Analogously, our brain has several layers of parallel processing systems. However, we tend only to be aware of our own surface-level consciousness and, as such, oscillate between Gerald Edelman's first and second nature, extended present moment sentience, or self-reflective, self-conscious awareness. We remain almost completely incognizant of unconscious processes that take place moment to moment within our own neuroanatomies, whether it is the circulation of blood and our pumping hearts, or the firing of neurons within our cerebral cortex. We are, in essence, strangers to our own genetic programming. In this way, it can be argued that we are predominantly occupied with the human user interface, what we commonly call the waking state. The 9 orifices of our body receive incoming data streams, and we react accordingly, depending on the waves and intensity of information that impacts us. But for the most part, we are not aware, even for seconds, about how these data streams get appropriately channeled. We are witnesses to an ongoing process that seldom requires our deepest attention. And even when our body demands our immediate and undivided attention, we are often helpless to do anything, since the operating system of being human, OSOBH, is beyond our conscious reach. This is why there has been a history of missteps in medicine throughout the centuries, and why, in turn, we have yet to solve even the most mundane of illnesses, such as the common cold. Back in the 1980s, as an undergraduate student at UCSD, I conducted a research study on behalf of my then mentor V.S. Ramachandran, who has become famous worldwide for his pioneering work on the brain and visual perception. He was curious about how the brain could produce a singular impression of an object when, in fact, distinct channels within the visual cortex were processing the information related to it. We conducted a number of fairly simple but nevertheless sophisticated experiments to better pinpoint how the brain uses impressionistic and filling-in procedures so as to best compute color and motion and synchronize them as a whole, even though processed by different channels. As Ramachandran concluded in his August 1987 paper published in Nature, the strategy allows economy of information processing and also ensures perceptual synchronization of form and color as the object moves. But most tellingly, our sense of a unified field of awareness remains oblivious of all the machinations and shorthand tricks that go on behind the scenes. We are ignorant of the unconscious programs, so to say, and are only dutifully conscious of the illusory but highly beneficial result. Emerson elaborated on the varietals of illusions we confront in our lifetime. There are deceptions of the senses, deceptions of the passions, and the structural, beneficent illusions of sentiment and of the intellect. There is the illusion of love, which attributes to the beloved person all which that person shares with his or her family, sex, age, or condition, nay, with the human mind itself. 'Tis these which the lover loves, and Anna Matilda gets the credit of them, as if one shut up always in a tower with one window, through which the face of heaven and earth could be seen, should fancy that all the marvels he beheld belonged to that window. There is the illusion of time, which is very deep. Who has disposed of it? Or come to the conviction that what seems the succession of thought is only the distribution of wholes into causal series? The intellect sees that every atom carries the whole of nature, that the mind opens to omnipotence, that in the endless striving and ascents the metamorphosis is entire, so that the soul doth not know itself in its own act, when that act is perfected. There is illusion that shall deceive even the elect. There is illusion that shall deceive even the performer of the miracle. Though he makes his body, he denies that he makes it. Though the world exists from thought, thought is daunted in presence of the world. One after the other, we accept the mental laws, still resisting those which follow, which, however, must be accepted. But all our concessions only compel us to new profusion. And what avails it that science has come to treat space and time as simply forms of thought, and the material world as hypothetical, and withal our pretension of property and even of selfhood are fading with the rest, if at last even our thoughts are not finalities, but the incessant flowing and ascension reach these also, and each thought which yesterday was a finality today is yielding to a larger generalization. We live on the outer perimeter of our own bodies and thus still remain aliens to our own home. No wonder the human species is a jumbled morass of confusion. To echo the words of Nietzsche, the world suffers from paroxysms of madness, and it only because of this that life becomes somewhat understandable. Socrates may have been considered wise to admonish us to know thyself, but how can we know ourself when the greatest part of who we are remains hidden from view? Our consciousness is merely the topography of a vast ocean, something that Freud understood all too well. But psychoanalysis notwithstanding, the greatest difficulty we confront is that we have evolved not necessarily to understand how the universe works, but to find ways and means to survive within it. In this way, much of our unraveling of the human condition will be counterintuitive, and what we may assume to be true and evidential on the surface may, on deeper inspection, turn out to be something quite different. This may partially explain why such movies as The Matrix have become philosophically popular worldwide, since they touch upon a universal idea that we live in a veiled cosmos, and that our body-brain complex perennially tricks us. Right now, in this very room, there are innumerable channels of potential knowledge, but we only access a minute portion of them. Depending on the limits of our receiving set, in our case, the triune brain, we can only tune in to a certain set of frequencies, and from this limited data set we extrapolate and pontificate about the world and its ultimate meaning and purpose. Yet, we would immediately recognize the absurdity of our quest if we look at any other animal and imagine how they would ultimately interpret reality. Do we really think that a cow, a dog, or a dolphin, given their respective cranial limits, can deduce how and why they behave or think as they do? Or do we immediately cognize that the limits of their skull are to some measure the limits of their respective worlds? This is not to suggest, of course, that an external reality apart from our bodies doesn't exist, or that we are consciously creating our own mini-realities, but only that our filtering mechanisms are not uber-clear transparencies for how things are. Rather, our brains developed from a biological sense as eco-adapters to eke out a living within the local environment so as to best navigate its relative survival, at least long enough to produce viable offspring. Therefore, any deep understanding of human cognition must first understand the historical context from which it initially arose over time. Simply put, a theory of human consciousness necessitates a deep understanding of biological evolution and natural selection, since it is the guiding mechanism for why certain species flourish and others decay into extinction. Consciousness, therefore, is a contextual medium as well as a communicative one. Hence, one's awareness is invariably related to keeping one's body alive long enough so as to ensure progeny. Self-reflective awareness, in other words, doesn't arise within a sterile vacuum, but is the result of a long history of survival successes, since those who didn't withstand nature's cruel and unrelenting competitive game are no longer genetic contenders. All this serves as a necessary prelude to understand the inherent difficulties in developing a robust science of mysticism. All too often, the mystic quest wants to bracket away the physics of awareness, neglecting how and why consciousness emerged as a virtual simulator to better map out future competitive strategies and thereby increase its survival rate. More importantly, the inner journey isn't a pure and unadulterated glimpse into higher realities as such, since what we experience within is also bounded by a whole series of poorly understood pathways. If our brains evolved to neurally trick us so as to better help us make immediate judgments and future predictions in order to live an extra day, then we should be doubly cautious with what magnificent tricks it has in store for us when we penetrate into different realms of awareness. Just as Columbus was mistaken in his map-making when attempting to find a new and perhaps faster route to the east, only to discover hitherto unknown lands, the spiritual aspirant should also be wary of prematurely confusing a preset cartography for the real territory. Interestingly, a number of mystics have also been aware of this danger, and spiritual literature is replete with warning neophytes about not succumbing too early to seductive visions and experiences one achieves within meditation. Ironically, mature skepticism, a cornerstone of science, is also regarded as a virtue in certain interior pursuits, since mystics, like their scientific counterparts, realized early on that much of what transpires within is also illusory. Being skeptical shouldn't be confused with being cynical. The former is a process of actually gathering more, not less, information, whereas the latter is a way of restricting new and unexpected data by twisting its value before allowing it to settle in. Near-death experiences, or, more accurately, the reporting of near-death experiences, provides a revealing talisman for exploring the question of whether such encounters are the result of neural trickery or flashes of something trans-rational. Not surprisingly, there are two major viewpoints on NDEs. The spiritualist camp, which includes those who hold that near-death experiences are indeed glimpses of an afterlife where consciousness transcends the physical body, and the naturalist camp, which argues that NDEs are best explained by the biochemistry of the brain. The jury has not yet decided which camp is correct, or if there is some other alternative purview that has yet to be explored. Yet, even at this preliminary stage, there are some telltale indications in these various reports that show quite clearly how consciousness operates as a virtual simulator, and how easy it is to be taken in by such simulations. That we don't always recognize these projections as projections is of elemental importance. Since the power and persuasiveness of any vision is equal to the degree that we believe them to be real. Why this is mostly the case appears to be related to our ancestral past, where we had to make quick, on-the-spot judgments about an unusual sight or noise or smell in order not to get attacked by a predator. We might be mistaken in making such hasty assumptions, but, on average, these presumptions have survival value. Michael Shermer provides a lucid explanation of why our brains evolved for such an adaptation. In my 2000 book, How We Believe, I argue that our brains are belief engines, evolved pattern recognition machines that connect the dots and create meaning out of the patterns that we think we see in nature. Sometimes A really is connected to B. Sometimes it is not. When it is, we have learned something valuable about the environment from which we can make predictions that aid in survival and reproduction. We are the descendants of those most successful at finding patterns. This process is called association learning, and it is fundamental to all animal behavior, from the humble worm C. elegans to H. sapiens. Unfortunately, we did not evolve a baloney detection network in the brain to distinguish between true and false patterns. We have no error detection governor to modulate the pattern recognition engine. Thus, the need for science with its self-correcting mechanisms of replication and peer review. But such erroneous cognition is not likely to remove us from the gene pool, and would therefore not have been selected against by evolution. This is a truly ironic situation in which we are predisposed to believe in weird things because of our evolved need to believe non-weird things. In other words, According to Harvard University biologist Kevin R. Foster and University of Helsinki biologist Hanna Kokko, the inability of individuals, human or otherwise, to assign causal probabilities to all sets of events that occur around them will often force them to lump causal associations with non-causal ones. From here, the evolutionary rationale for superstition is clear. Natural selection will favor strategies that make many incorrect causal associations in order to establish those that are essential for survival and reproduction. The brain tricks us into believing something to be real when it is not, provided that such trickery provides with a survival advantage. Within this context, therefore, it could be argued that NDEs may have much more to do with keeping one alive than some purported visions of the afterlife. There is, in fact, one common denominator amongst all those who report NDEs. They didn't die. A couple illustrative examples may better underline this obvious point. Early in his teaching career, my husband, David, was teaching at a Catholic high school and broached the subject of NDEs. One of my high school students at Morrow back in 1979 talked privately to me after class and said that he too had an NDE, but was reluctant to tell anyone about it because he didn't see Jesus or a religious figure. Instead, he told me that he went through a long, dark tunnel, and at the end, in a brilliant, scintillating light, he saw the most beautiful bicycle ever. The moment he saw the bike, he remembered that his birthday was in a couple of days, and that his mum had promised to buy him a Schwinn 10-speed. That very thought brought him immediately back to his body, and he regained consciousness in the emergency room. Later, he was told that he had died on the operating table, but was resuscitated minutes later. Later, on a research project in India, I was informed of an Indian woman who was doing seva in the langar of her guru and had a terrible accident. Everyone around her presumed she was dead, and she was sent to hospital. However, she was resuscitated and regained consciousness. Several devotees wanted to know what she experienced during that time, but what she recalled both shocked and bemused them. My entire body went frozen, and I entered into a long, dark tunnel with a beautiful, radiant light at the end. But I didn't see our Guruji, but rather a large, glowing chapati. I immediately realized that I was needed in the kitchen, since it was my duty to make food for lunch. Once I saw that chapati in the light, I immediately woke up, and here I am in the hospital bed. It may well be that whenever the body-brain is under severe stress, such as when one has a heart attack or is in a car accident, consciousness elicits an ultimatum package of patterned meanings, drawn specifically from one's own unique biographical, psychological history, to encourage one to live and resist dying. This may be similar to an adrenaline rush that automatically occurs when one has to find extra strength in order to lift a heavy object to save a beloved from harm's way. This helps explain why Christians, having NDEs, tend to see Jesus at the end of the tunnel and not Lord Krishna, and why Sikhs may see Guru Nanak and not the Virgin Mary. That NDEs are culturally variable is instructive, even if there may well be core elements common to all, from tunnels, lights, and inner sounds. Paul Tillich, the noted Protestant theologian of the 20th century, defined religion as anything for which we have an ultimate concern. And, arguably, this would suggest that whenever one has an NDE, it would elicit from a person's memory those meaning systems or beliefs which were of greatest concern, so as to serve as a goading reminder about why one should want to live and not die. As my husband, David, points out in his paper, M.E., The Theory of Meaning Equivalence and the Flourishing of Religion, any meaning is better than no meaning, provided such meaning allows one to live an extra day and increase his or her survival odds in terms of replicating strategies. If this is the case, then the obvious neural trick involved in NDEs is that we are not recognizing numinous visions as our own projections, since such recognition may render the experience less persuasive and powerful. This is similar to fantastic dreams, which can be overwhelming and mesmerizing, provided that we think they are really happening. The moment we realize that they are just dreams without any binding force, we are no longer bounded by the same fear or desire. A classmate of mine was once haunted with nightmares of a monster that was chasing after him, and from whom he was constantly hiding and running away. When he recounted his tale to his psychology teacher, he was told to remember one simple thing. Everything that arises in a dream, both good and bad, are merely manifestations from your own self. Be aware of that, and the terrifying monster will lose its power over you. Interestingly, that is precisely what happened. My friend remembered this sage advice, and the next time he saw the monster, he shook its hand, and the monster said that he was only chasing him because he wanted to be friends. He never had the same nightmare again. In general, no one doubts his or her NDE while it is happening. Imagine, if you will, that a cardiac patient has an NDE and sees what he believes to be Jesus in the midst of the light as he is having an out-of-body experience. Further imagine that this envisioned Jesus speaks to him and tells him about his future life. Yet right in the middle of the proceedings the patient starts asking all sorts of impertinent questions to the apparition, such as, "How do I know it is really you, Jesus? Why do you look like the paintings from my childhood education at St. Francis Elementary School? What took you so long to show up?" etc. The brain has an amazing ability to make us believe almost anything it engineers, and herein lays the great epistemological conundrum for would-be mystics. How does one determine what is real versus illusory? We already know from our own lives how easy it is to be duped by a whole array of mind-teasing illusions. So why would be going within be any easier? Aldis Huxley, of course, famously argued that the mind was a filtering mechanism and that human consciousness simply couldn't function if it were allowed to receive all incoming data streams. If such a situation were to occur, perhaps our only viable response would be one of perpetual catatonia. The ability to function for a set duration in any relative geometric space means that one must be largely edited by the physical rules governing such an enclosure. Hence, my psychology is the product of the intersection of physics and biology, even if I may be subjectively oblivious of how these laws actually work. The phantom limb sensation is a good illustration of just how mistaken we can be about what occurs within our nervous system. A majority of amputees report that they can still feel pain in their amputated hand, arm, or leg when they know that such extensions have been long removed. The brain is a modeling system, and even if an arm has been amputated, the image of that arm and its attendant connections to pleasure or pain still resides within the Rolodex of remembered sensations. We can even see things that are not there. Perceptual filling in is how our spectra of vision compensates for missing information due to our physiological blind. Thus, a wobbly image can be arrested and stabilized on our retina, which can lead to a filling up of the surrounding background by images that are literally not there. The mystic who is interested in bypassing mental hallucinations must be a seasoned skeptic. Otherwise, he or she will invariably confuse their brain state for the real state, and this is arguably the original error of what it is like to be human. Freud had long believed that one of his great, if not greatest, discoveries in psychology was how transference among some of his patients operated. Within about 6 months or less, they would project, albeit unconsciously, all sorts of fantastical ideas about their doctor, but without a hint of recognition that it was their own doing. In other words, they took to be objective that was in truth wholly subjective. This conflation of one's internal brain state for an objective reality is an elemental part of what it means to be human. Is this not the underlying modus operandi behind the differences between other species? The world a bee sees or the world a goldfish envisions is demarcated by how their respective bodies interact with their local environment. But do we really think that a lizard's brain reveals the ontological truth of the cosmos? Hence, it may be the height of hubris to believe, as we do too often, that our own evolved craniums can grasp the wholeness of the universe when, in point of fact, we only partake a sliver of it. One of the most skeptical of religious texts is the Tibetan Book of the Dead, or the Bardo Thodol. What is perhaps most intriguing about the Tibetan Book of the Dead, at least from a scientific perspective, is its thoroughly rational and skeptical character. Although the text does instruct the neophyte to accept the clear void light as one's own, it does not describe in precise terms what the light is. Instead, it concentrates on what the light is not. It is not anything that can be heard, touched, or felt, even on a higher or more elevated plane of awareness. It is, on the contrary, the suchness or context or spectrum out of which all things operate, but in and of itself cannot be grasped as any particular thing. Thus it is always identified through negation, neti, not this, not that, or through negative images, emptiness, void, vacuity, etc. It is, if we can describe it at all, no thing. The implications for the dying Lama are clear. Do not accept whatever may arise in the intermediate stage just after death, for each apparition betrays its real origin, imputing a sense of reality and permanence upon something that has neither. Realize, rather, that nirvana is the source from which all visions arise and is therefore itself not a vision. Or, put in more philosophical terms, truth is the condition from which all conditions arise, itself not being a secondary effect. Immanuel Kant turned philosophy on itself with his Critique of Pure Reason, essentially demonstrating that our very faculties for discerning truth are themselves tainted. If you have been born with blue sunglasses embedded upon your eyes from birth, then of course the world is forever tinted. Thus, to crib the immortal words of Aldis Huxley, philosophy's first task is to clean the doors of perception, lest we conflate our neurological limitations with the world around us. But is it even possible? Can mystics, of whatever stripe and of whatever time, truly and purely understand the cosmos around them? Are we not so weighted down by our body-brain complex that, no matter how much we wish to become objective to all that we see, our subjectivity inevitably contours the final result? This is precisely the conundrum that quantum physicists such as Niels Bohr, Werner Heisenberg, and Erwin Schrödinger discovered in the 1920s, to Einstein's lasting consternation. Nature has turned out to be trickster at its very core, revealing as much as it is concealing. Any measuring device, from a simple yardstick to complex differential equations, mismeasures, even if only minutely and unintentionally. Kurt Gödel demonstrated, most likely to Bertrand Russell's eternal consternation, the impossibility of proving the perfect logic of math, since at its core there is an incompleteness. As we come to grips with the limits of knowledge, the deep mystery we must first confront is epistemological. We have a tendency to conflate our neurology for ontology, and as such tend to inflate the world around us with our own unrecognized projections, which may or may not be accurate. And since we are stuck to such map-making, we are circumscribed by a logical syllogism that, on the surface, seems intractable. All maps, by definition, are less than the territory to which they point, because if the map is exactly as large as the land itself, then such a map would be superfluous, and thus have gaps. And if all maps invariably have gaps, then all such designs are inevitably, even if only partially, mistaken. What this means, of course, is that all the delineations we make about the world around us are potentially wrong, because they are not perfect transparencies. This is why science always rediscovers the unknowable, because no matter how sophisticated our maps may be, they will have a gap in them, which will reveal something hitherto undiscovered. This is also why Karl Popper's notion of falsifiability serves us so well when appraising most scientific theories. We know a priori that human speculations, even if amazingly well grounded in physics or math, are always liable to error. It is this liability that, ironically, allows science to progress. A new technological product, for instance, isn't accepted as flawless, but is rather closely examined by hackers and others to reveal some uninspected flaws. And because of this ongoing dialectic, we have seen breathtaking changes in a variety of objects, from computers to cars. All academic subjects have their epistemological cul-de-sacs. In math, we have Gödel's incompleteness theorem that essentially says consistency of such a system cannot be proved within the system. In physics, we have Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, or relations, which simply states it is impossible to know with absolute precision the momentum and position of an electron, since the more certain you are about an electron's position, the less certain you are about its momentum, and vice versa. In astronomy, we have the Einstein limit of light that tells us that we can only see so far with our telescopes within the parameters of relativity, and the list goes on. Science will undoubtedly expand our previous limits and horizons, but we will inevitably be stuck with our own neural constraints from the very beginning. And herein lays the great human dilemma. The limits of our skull are the limits of our understanding. Yes, we may augment our brains with artificial devices in the future, but even here we will only confront a new limit in time. Ralph Waldo Emerson, in a section of The Conduct of Life, circa 1860, captures this human dilemma quite well when he wrote, "Society does not love its unmaskers." It was wittily, if somewhat bitterly, said by D'Alembert. "I find men victims of illusion in all parts of life. Children, youths, adults, and old men, all are led by one bauble or another. Yoganidra, the goddess of illusion, Proteus or Momus, or Gilfy's mocking, for the power has many names, is stronger than the Titans, stronger than Apollo. Few have overheard the gods, or surprised their secret. Life is a succession of lessons which must be lived to be understood. All is riddle, and the key to a riddle is another riddle. There are as many pillows of illusion as flakes in a snowstorm. We wake from one dream into another dream. The toys, to be sure, are various and are graduated in refinement to the quality of the dupe. The intellectual man requires a fine bait. The sots are easily amused, but everybody is drugged with his own frenzy, and the pageant marches at all hours, with music and banner and badge. Or, as the essay Exploring the Dangers of Reification emphasizes, phenomenologically speaking, yes, we do live in a multiverse of differing states of awareness, but I think we should be cautious about how we use the word real when describing what these experiences ultimately mean and entail. For instance, I remember as a young kid walking on the beach in Santa Monica, and my friends and I would see gold glittering on the wet sand. For part of the day we really thought we were going to be rich, since we had discovered a precious metal. Of course, our parents quickly dampened our millionaire dreams when they explained that it was only fool's gold, since it was simply how the light reflected off the water and sand to give it that unique sparkle. Okay, so as a kid I had an experience of gold, but it wasn't really gold at all. What changed? My interpretation of the phenomenon. The thing itself remained the same, even though my experience was irrevocably altered. When it comes to subtler realms of consciousness, the difficulty in determining the relative reality or permanence or consensually share inputs of what arises is much more fraught with potential missteps, given the paucity of an overwhelming agreement on such matters. The mystic, in this context, is indeed a skeptic, never taking for granted that which arises to be the totality of what is, but rather always looking behind the screen for the deeper explanation. This invokes a natural humility in such a seeker, since he or she knows, a priori, that whatever is discovered is never the ultimate as ultimate, since it is never-ending quest that always increases one's sense of the infinite. Crudely, we are like wayfarers who stand on the seashore, who at first can only see 50 yards out to sea because of a dense fog. But as the sun begins to penetrate, our vision of the horizon increases minute by minute. Likewise, the more we understand the limitations of our purviews, the more willing we become to transcend them with ever-improving vistas. This is why the mystic scientist Nicholas of Cusa long ago argued that the way of knowledge is, paradoxically, through the way of ignorance. Science has made tremendous progress exactly because it is predicated upon being potentially wrong in its map-making, and thereby allows better-informed cartographies to replace what has come before. While tradition may be honored and respected from Archimedes to Newton, science works best by upsetting and uprooting authorities of the past by looking for any possible errors or gaps in earlier knowledge systems. As the article The Feynman Imperative illustrates, but again, what makes science work and progress is that it is predicated not upon what we desire or wish, but rather competing our guesses, hunches, and theories by allowing them to be tested in real-world situations and against other hypotheses and other viewpoints. In this remarkable cauldron, we uncover those ideas which survive W.V. Quine's intertwining holism. Any ism can do the same. Science is, after all, a human enterprise and open to anyone, anytime, anywhere. But to qualify as scientific, it must do that most remarkable of things. It must be willing to be disproven, to be corrected, to admit to error. Let me illustrate this from an incident that happened to me when I bought the first Apple iPad back in 2010 and brought it to the computer technical support team at my college. I wrongly assumed that they would be mesmerized by the new gadget, and I was expecting some oohs and ahs. That is not what I got. Instead, almost from the moment they placed their hands on the touch screen and began swiping this or that app, they voiced complaints. It doesn't have flash, that sucks. No camera, no SD slots, and so on. I was taken aback and thought to myself that these techies don't appreciate a good product when it stares them in the face. But then, later that night, I smiled and realized that they were right to be so critical. Why? Because seeing the flaws or the mistakes or the weaknesses in something and imagining better ways to do it is precisely how such tablets will be improved in the future. And so they have, as anyone with an iPad 4 or an iPad 5 will attest. Science works and advances because it is rooted in trying to spot weaknesses or flaws or insufficiencies. It is in a way conscious map-making, where the would-be cartographer is constantly surveying possible gaps in the best up-to-date topographies. Feynman cautioned his would-be scientists at Caltech on their graduation day that the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. While this is certainly helpful advice, the problem is that our brains were designed to trick us from the very start, since every experience we have of the world, both within and without, isn't, as Kant pointed out centuries prior, the thing in itself, but rather the end result of filtering process which invariably colours whatever we see and hear and touch around us. The recognition that the mind is a simulator par excellence doesn't liberate us from its unceasing simulations, since even that recognition is part and parcel a simulation as well. We are living in a neural paradox which may be likened to an endless hall of mirrors where what we think we recognize as real and substantive may, on closer inspection, be merely an image of an image of an image ad infinitum. Perhaps if we kept in mind our own very limited perceptions, we could avoid the greatest pitfall of all, the delusion of certainty. Science's greatest gift to us personally may be that of humility. Why? Because, as Stuart Kauffman in his book Reinventing the Sacred in Tones, reason itself has finally led us to see the inadequacy of reason. We must therefore reunite our full humanity. We must see ourselves whole, living in a creative world we can never fully know. Stephen Wolfram, in his large and to some overhyped megavolume, A New Kind of Science, comes to a similar conclusion as Kauffman, when he realized the limitations of computational reducibility, when he writes, "In the end, the principle of computational equivalence encapsulates both the ultimate power and the ultimate weakness of science. For it implies that all the wonders of our universe can in effect be captured by simple rules, yet it shows that there can be no way to know all the consequences of these rules, except, in effect, just to watch and see how they unfold." What all this portends, and the wise counsel it engenders, is that each one of us is on an open quest, whether we be mystics or scientists, and, whatever discoveries we make on the way, we must be cautious not to be dogmatic in our pronouncements, knowing too well how limited our understanding may be at any particular point in time, and how easy nature can trick us in her multifarious fashions. Nicholas of Cusa, writing in Latin, called this proglomena unlearned ignorance, and famously quipped, paradoxically as it may at first sound, that the unattainable was attained by its unattainment. We are better educated, in other words, when we realize how little we know. Or, as Nicholas of Cusa himself penned, "For a man, even one very well versed in learning, will attain unto nothing more perfect than to be found to be most learned in the ignorance which is distinctively his. The more he knows that he is unknowing, the more learned he will be." The warning shot for would-be mystics is that we are under the spell of a cerebral mirage, and to understand what consciousness is, we must first come to grips with its beguiling and deceptive nature. As the article The Physics of Deception states, and yet, maybe understanding the very root of Maya is precisely how and why science has progressed where other paths have failed. Why? Because science, unlike traditional religions of the past, is a consistent method of doubting what we think we know and not relying on what we may wish to be the case. Science, in other words, is a path of systemic disbelief, which, like the very literal meaning of Maya, looks askance at disparate phenomena and its attendant explanations which invoke affirmations of I believe, and proclaims something inherently more radical. Neti, neti. Not this, not that. and by such a procedure patiently unravels the hidden knot that for millennia has remained unraveled. As a child, I was fascinated by a set of Chinese boxes which contained smaller boxes hidden within it. However, I couldn't access all the boxes at once, since each were locked by a secret panel that I had to discover and then unlatch. Recently there has been much pointed, if controversial, discussion in astrophysics about how our universe may be a subset of something much grander, but which is clouded from view. Razia Porhazen, Neerjesh Asfordi, and Robert B. Mann, in a recent paper published in the Journal of Cosmology and Astroparticle Physics, theorized that our three-dimensional universe emerged as a consequence of the formation of a black hole in a higher-dimensional universe, but which is cloaked by something similar to an event horizon. In a more popularized version of their thesis, the black hole at the beginning of time, in the August issue of Scientific American, the authors propose that the Big Bang is a cosmic mirage. Our picture would cloak the singularity at the Big Bang just as an event horizon cloaks the singularity at the heart of a black hole. In this sense, we are living in a three-dimensional holographic image of a four-dimensional parent universe. We are, and not just metaphorically, the descendants of a cosmic beginning for which we have no direct access. The rishis of old had long felt that something was deeply amiss about our understanding of reality, and that a deeper truth remained obscured from view. Today, scientists from almost all different fields have come to a similar conclusion, albeit with a whole array of supporting evidences to back up their claims. It looks as if we are indeed lost in an almost infinite labyrinth, as envisioned by Jorge Borges. We live in a set of Chinese boxes, falsely presuming that we have reached the limit of such encasements. As Max Tegmark, author of The Mathematical Universe, concludes, "If my life as a physicist has taught me anything at all, it's that Plato was right. Modern physics has made abundantly clear that the ultimate nature of reality isn't what it seems. I became free of Maya when I realized that I could never escape from her." Anonymous. That which we know is a little thing. That which we do not know is immense. Pierre-Simon de Laplace. The Oceanic Metaphor. Meaning Equivalence, M.E. Probability Theory and the Virtual Simulation Hypothesis of Consciousness. 10 Waves of Information. Any meaning, even if nonsensical, is better than no meaning, provided such meaning makes one want to live an extra day. 1. Guiding waves. Humans are not good at grasping the very large or the very small. We are intermediate creatures, and as such evolved to understand that which was conducive for our reproductive survival. In a world where everything is predicated upon living long enough to pass on one's genetic code, it is not surprising that we have evolved all sorts of mechanisms in order to survive nature's often horrific game of eat or be eaten. It appears that once we developed self-reflective consciousness or became acutely aware of a time beyond the extended present, we realized the terrifying consequences of what it is like to be alive in carnivore land. This balancing act between being in this world or eliminating one's participation within it is nature's ledger, and from evolution's accounting, those who can find any reason, no matter how absurd or fanciful, to continue living are the winners, and thus get to continue their lineal descent. As Charles Darwin realized early, this is a most pregnant observation indeed about human thinking and behavior, since it provides a telltale clue about why, in general, we tend to hold that any meaning is better than no meaning, provided such meaning allows us to live an extra day. Similar to Noam Chomsky's universal grammar, which suggests that we are predisposed to language even before learning to speak, so too it would seem that we are predisposed to finding meaning and purpose even in the midst of a universe that may, ultimately, be devoid of both. We are a forever connective species, associating the most disparate elements and creating mosaics of meaning whenever possible, warding off as much as conceivable a free fall into purposeless vertigo. Our navigating awareness precipitously rests upon a most delicate gyroscope of making sense of all that we experience, even as we intuit at certain inopportune moments the random chaos of it all. In this presentation, we will first focus on the theory of meaning equivalence, which, in part, explains why so many religions flourish, even if some of their mythological ideas seem utterly fantastical. Second, we explore probability theory via Littlewood's work on large numbers and desultory decussation, and why humans in general suffer from varying degrees of apophenia, seeing patterns and agents in hitherto chaotic events. Third, we will examine why consciousness evolved primarily as a virtual simulator and how, in turn, we are inclined to conflate our neurology with ontology. And fourth, we will turn our attention to the contentious issue of whether human consciousness is substrate neutral and best understood as wave pattern of information. To better appreciate our existential situation, I have employed the ocean as a metaphor since, with all its unpredictability, it serves as a practical template to better understand why self-reflective awareness, like a life raft at sea, works as a navigating buffer and not necessarily as an open-sourced transparency to reality at large. 2. Probability waves. There are well over 300 million cubic miles of water on our planet, as Wallace J. Nichols points out in his new book, Blue Mind. Given such a huge volume of H2O, there is a colossal number of possibilities within this saline arena, most of which remains unexplored. To appreciate this incredible vastness, keep in mind that in only 1 cubic mile there are well over 1 trillion gallons of water. 300 million multiplied by 1 trillion is a number that staggers our imagination. Yet this statistic is almost nothing when compared to how immensely big our observable universe is, which is roughly estimated to be at least 90 billion light-years in diameter and continually expanding at an accelerating rate. Of course, if this universe is part of an unseen multiverse containing innumerable astronomical systems, our very notion of numbered measurements may be likened to a young girl trying to count all the grains of sand around the world one by one. As quantum theory has revealed, even to the consternation of Einstein and others who didn't want to believe in a god who played dice, we live in a probabilistic universe. In sum, we are probability avatars. It is as if, metaphorically speaking, we are the result of some cosmic poker game where all the players are blind and where the winning hand is both selected and randomly determined. Perhaps the universe is built upon a mathematical superstructure such that all that we see around us is the result of numbers and their relations fleshed out over time. Max Tegmark, currently a professor at MIT and a well-regarded cosmologist, argues that our reality isn't just described by mathematics, it is mathematics in a very specific sense. Is the universe the product of a mathematical skeletal schema such that what we see around us is akin to a holographic projection that betrays its underlying geometric and numbered origin? While the scientific jury is still out on answering this particular query, it is interesting to note that we now have a sufficient series of telling analogies from our virtual lives, as expressed in our varying computational smart devices, to better understand the implications of Tegmark's MUH hypothesis. The theory that the universe is math made flesh is an instructive one, even if it only turns out to be part of a larger patchwork. We already know that Einstein's theory of relativity can only be properly understood within a geometric framework where gravity is geometry. Likewise, our deeper appreciation of quantum mechanics necessitates coming to grips with indeterminism and how probability plays an elemental part in how we not only measure the very small, but also how we alter it by our array of instrumentations. Contemplating these ideas sparks within us a deeper appreciation of how precious life is, and how studying the theory of large numbers can awaken a keener perspective on why numeracy is just as important as literacy, particularly when calculating the nearly impossible odds against one's very existence. The stupendous implications of chance and necessity, to echo the title of biologist Jacques Monod's famous 1970s book, is something that we tend never to dwell on, or more likely, seems of little practical consequence in our day-to-day lives. Imagine in this moment that you have a lottery scratcher ticket, and as you systematically scratch off your numbers and their adjoining prizes, you realize in the middle of this lecture that you have won a mega jackpot of £10 million. What would you do? I suspect that some would stand up and leave the room right now. One thing is for sure, however, it would wake us up and give us a huge and intoxicating adrenaline rush. The winning ticket holder might later ruminate about his or her good fortune and reflect upon how lucky they were, given the astronomical odds against them, 1 in 2,400,000, in securing that particular ticket. I give this illustration because a winning lottery number exponentially pales in comparison to the odds against us being alive and breathing at this very juncture in history. But in order to appreciate the anomaly of one's existence, it is necessary to get a deeper understanding of the theory of large numbers. Just think of your own conception as a starting-off point. A usual male produces about 100 million sperm per ejaculation. Only one of those sperm will survive the arduous journey to its terminal apex. How many sperm does a male produce in, say, an 80-year lifespan? No precise count is possible, since it varies with each individual, but one can roughly estimate the number to be around 500 billion. Or perhaps more impressive sounding as a 1/2 trillion. If your own father had 5 children, this would mean that just in terms of sperm, you are a 1 in a 100 billion winner. Couple this with the rarity of your mother's egg. Of the nearly 500,000 follicles, where only about 400 or so will become viable, and the very fact that you are alive is beyond any moneyed lottery you will ever enter. But this is only an infinitesimally small fraction of the monumental odds against you being here, since one has to factor in all the preceding ancestors who came before. Roughly speaking, and depending on how many children were sired, the odds of 1 in a 100 billion doubles every generation, so that if you trace your lineage back to Africa 85,000 years ago, the odds become ever more daunting. This too, of course, is but a smidgen when one realizes that each of us trace our evolutionary past from humans to single-cell organisms, a journey stretching back to the origins of life on this planet some 4.5 billion years ago. And even this is only 1/3 of the story, since the atoms that comprise us have their basis in a history that is nearly 14 billion years old. A visual infographic entitled "What Are the Odds?", which has gone viral on the internet, puts the number against you being alive right now as innumerably greater than all the particles in the universe. This has led erstwhile sober scientists to theorize that the universe appears to be consciously designed, with humans ultimately in mind. Naturally, such statistical comparisons can, from the very start, be misleading, given that we are already alive, and one can, if he or she so desires, do relatively the same odds for anything on terra firma. including the astronomical odds against that bottle of Coca-Cola your uncle drank last night. Yet there is no getting around the fact that evolution is a universal version of the Hunger Games writ large. The survival of our distinctive genetic code over eons of time is a remarkable testimony to its fitness and adaptability. But what is even more remarkable is how much luck was involved in our temporarily resisting the second law of thermodynamics. In other words, regardless of whether we calculate the odds for a wild grain of rice, a bottlenose dolphin, or a Tibetan monk to live, even momentarily, on this third planet from the sun, is a rarity enjoyed by a diminishing few. The enormous evolutionary pressure that is placed upon us is nearly immeasurable. If we stop to consider that none of our ancestors failed in their genetic transmissions, since otherwise we would not exist, everything is competing, consciously or otherwise, for a temporary safe haven, realizing all too well how easy it is to be eliminated from the proceedings. It is no surprise, therefore, to realize that most of us never fully awaken to this horror show we call daily life. To emotionally feel this existential situation is literally unbearable, and gives fuel to why Albert Camus could reasonably argue in the myth of Sisyphus with a straight face that there is only one really serious philosophical question, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest, whether or not the world has 3 dimensions, whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, comes afterwards. These are games one must first answer, and if it is true, as Nietzsche claims, that a philosopher, to deserve our respect, must preach by example, you can appreciate the importance of that reply, for it will precede the definitive act. These are facts the heart can feel, yet they call for careful study before they become clear to the intellect. Shakespeare, writing centuries before, perhaps captured this human dilemma best, when in the nunnery scene of the play Hamlet he writes in a soliloquy, "To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them. To die, to sleep no more, and by a sleep to say we end the heartache, and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. To die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub, for in that sleep of death what dreams may come, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin? Who would these fardels bear, to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have, than fly to others that we know not of. Thus conscience does make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er, with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pitch and moment with this regard their currents turn awry, and lose the name of action. Soft you now, the fair Ophelia, nymph in all thy orisons, be thou all my sins remembered. Thus, it is not surprising that Homo sapiens, with their enlarged brains which see well beyond the day's horizon, should have developed fine-tuned antennae for reasons and purposes to prolong living and not simply give up. But for something to be truly meaningful, as the social theorist Peter Berger insightfully argued decades ago, It must be seen as believable and plausible. Otherwise, if our beliefs lack such a requisite plausibility, we are thrown back once again to that most precarious of postures, looking down at the abyss. In other words, we must find something of value and of truth in our seeking, and to the degree that we feel assured in our philosophical or religious templates, the easier it is for us to willfully act towards a calculated goal. Thus, meaning or purpose isn't as powerful if only seen as merely projective and relative. The more we are convinced in the truth of our chosen trajectories, the more energy we feel in accomplishing our stated aims. A good example of how this operates can be seen in the movie version of The Wizard of Oz, where Dorothy is convinced by a whole host of external agents, from the lollipop kids to the Good Witch, that the best way to go home to Kansas is to follow the yellow brick road to the Emerald City and secure an audience with a mighty and powerful wizard. Dorothy must firmly believe that walking upon the yellow brick road is a genuine and viable path to ensure her liberation. Otherwise, she would be stalemated in her quest and be overwhelmed by an array of possibilities. More precisely, Dorothy must really believe before she can act. This is what Camus means when he says that we must answer the primary question of whether to succumb to suicide or not before we can embark on how to live this life. Imagine you are going to ride on a brand new roller coaster, and once seated you discover to your shock that the track hasn't yet been completed, and that at the very end of the ride you will end up dying in a huge ball of fire. Further, imagine that the roller coaster lasts for a set duration of time. Fill in the blank: an hour, a day, a year, a decade. On such an up and down journey you have two fundamental options. Jump early and die, or don't jump and die when it goes off the track. This is reminiscent of the opening sequence to the 1940s British movie A Matter of Life and Death, where the main character is a British Royal Air Force pilot, played by David Niven, returning from a bombing run during World War II. However, his plane is critically damaged and on fire. He is confronted with two options: stay with the plane until he is burned alive, or jump and most certainly die from impact. In a much less dramatic context, and with longer time gestations, is this not our own situation? Are we not also on that same ride in life, spinning as we do on a planet going some 60,000 plus miles an hour, year-long, around a massive object known as our Sun? Do we not have to decide whether we wish to stay or jump on this global spacecraft? What is it that prevents us from leaping? Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace discovered the answer, and it explains, perhaps too well, why the overwhelming majority of Homo sapiens do not commit suicide. Who we are right now is the result of a tremendously long line of successes. None of our ancestors killed themselves before puberty, since even one such premature death, consciously intended or not, means we wouldn't be alive today. We are an amazing repository of undying, the pun is intended, genetic successes, and as such carry within ourselves the unique record of our unimaginably competitive past. This is why Darwin could argue as early as 1859 in On the Origin of Species that, in the distant future I see open fields for more important researches. Psychology will be based on a new foundation, that of the necessary acquirement of each mental power and capacity by gradation. 4. Purposeful waves. Given this pruning heritage, it is no wonder that Homo sapiens appear to have a built-in meaning positioning system, MPS. Since, without such an inclination, the world's disorientations would be too overwhelming to navigate. I remember back in 2004, I suffered an acute vertigo attack while disembarking from our little electric boat. I was with my then 4-year-old son, Sean, and I couldn't stand up. So I put Sean on my back and slowly crawled along the dock up to the gangplank to a safer area. I couldn't position myself in the least since my world was spinning off its axis. All of this happened because I had taken one Vioxx pill that was prescribed by my dentist for recurring tooth pain. I have an older friend, a one-time Hollywood stuntman and coordinator, who told me of his own severe case of vertigo, which his doctors diagnosed as benign paroxysmal positional vertigo, BPPV, which is a condition resulting from loose debris, otoconia, that collect within a part of the inner ear. In addition to head injury, BPPV can occur due to the degeneration of inner ear hair cells during the natural process of aging. I bring this up precisely because I think it is a fitting analogy to the deep need in human beings to have a stabilizing meaning positioning system, MPS, particularly in a world where, to cite Darwin's quote of Tennyson, nature is red in tooth and claw. Just as the tiniest bits of otoconia within the inner ear can flatten the heartiest of men within seconds, so too can we succumb to any host of mental disturbances if we lose sight of some balancing meaning in our day-to-day lives. Otherwise, the world is too much, and we get lost in the onslaught of sensory chaos, not dissimilar to what happens when we drive in a major metropolis for the first time and we are without a proper map or GPS. What we regard as our normal lives hangs by a very thin line indeed. A simple phone call, for example, if it carries bad news about a loved one, can put us immediately into a tailspin. As anyone who has had a loved one die unexpectedly understands all too well. We live on an informational tightrope, and anything that allows us to keep our balance, even if illusory, is to our benefit. Self-reflective awareness without a working MPS is akin to funambulism without a net. Yet, needing meaning doesn't mean that such a model is necessarily true in any ultimate sense. In fact, meaning-seeking has precious little to do with facts or truth, but has much more to do with creating within us a desire to live. Keep in mind that anything that can keep the flame burning for us to battle another day is sufficient to ensure its survival, even if that value system is completely fictional. It is not an issue of fiction versus non-fiction as such, since our meaning systems are essentially buffers against reality, not necessarily crystal-clear windows of what lies beneath. 5. Virtual waves. I think it is fairly obvious what evolutionary benefit higher-order consciousness conveys upon those who have it. Any organism that can virtually simulate varying options within itself before outsourcing them in a real, empirical world has a tremendous advantage over creatures who lack such a simulacrum Rolodex. Think about what your consciousness does most of the time, particularly during an uneventful and tedious lecture on consciousness itself. It spaces out. We tend to dissociate and ruminate about all sorts of things, from fantasizing about this or that person, or imagining what we are going to do on vacation, or perhaps, if the lecture doesn't go too long, about what we are going to order at Veggie Grill. These mind wanderings allow us to conjure up all sorts of real and unreal possibilities, and as such allow us the opportunity to play out different endgame scenarios without ending up injured or dead. Those who lack such an internal theatre don't have the ability to rehearse, and thus are forced to act in a real and dangerous world almost immediately. There is undoubtedly a drawback to have such a conjuring mind, since it can, and often does, capture us in an admixture of fantastic phantasms which have no direct correlation to the eat-or-be-eaten world in which we live. We can also be subject to some truly horrifying delusions, such that it becomes nearly impossible to differentiate the exterior world from our interior machinations. This became clearer to me this past semester at Mount San Antonio College, where I became well acquainted with an older student in my Introduction to Philosophy class. He introduced himself early in this semester after I had given a lecture on consciousness as a virtual simulator. He couldn't look me in the eye and explained he hadn't left his house for nearly 20 years. He had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and had an inordinate fear of people. His doctor had advised him to go back to school, and my class was the first one he was taking. He was mesmerized by the idea of the virtual simulator, since he felt that it explained his situation to a T. He then proceeded to write a long narrative in which he described in excruciating detail what a typical day of his was like. Here is but one small excerpt. Now that I look back, I remember that I did experience mild panic attacks beginning at the tender age of 9 years old. I would sleep in a sitting position because I thought I was going to vomit my intestines if I slept lying down. I slept in this position for months. Now that I look back at this moment, I realize that this was just the beginning of the nightmare that lay ahead. You see, once a stubborn notion enters my mind, I cannot get rid of it. It completely takes over my mind and body. I guess I am so screwed up in my head that when a notion enters my mind, I get sick for days. My body gets overwhelmed with fear. I also begin to tremble. My head begins to hurt and my stomach begins to turn. I sometimes even suffer from diarrhea. The sickness lets me know that a negative notion has entered my mind. If the notion was caused by wearing a new shirt, I either don't ever wear the shirt again, or I decide to put up with the sickness every time I wear it. I have been asking myself the same question for 20 years. How can something as harmless as a shirt cause so much mental and physical pain? I know the shirt is not to blame for my defective mind, but I would still love to know the scientific explanation from beginning to end. I always end up depriving myself of many simple pleasures in life because I have associated them with pain. Half of the things I own I don't use because a negative notion in my head developed that induces fear every time I try to use these items. For example, I bought an expensive stereo a few years ago and I haven't touched it since then. I am afraid that my head is going to explode if I listen to the stereo. That is the crippling belief that exists in my mind. Every time I try to use these items, a rush of fear takes over me, and I begin to perspire. My stomach begins to turn, and I immediately begin to get sick. If I am ever in a rare, happy mood, all I have to do is reach out for one of these items, and fear and sickness will wreak havoc on my body and mind. As I got to know this student, we would invariably talk at length after our class was over. I realized how brilliant he was. Indeed, he was by far the brightest student I had taught in years, since he seemed to grasp almost any complex subject immediately, despite not having any academic training per se. What truly surprised me, though, was that once he understood the virtual simulator hypothesis, it noticeably calmed him down, because the model helped him better understand his own behavior and how he was fueling, even if unconsciously, his own obsessive behavior and getting trapped within it. Over the course of the term, he even began to make prolonged eye contact and to develop a sense of humor about his predicament. This student also claimed to have improved more in the past few weeks than he had in 10 years of seeing his psychiatrist. It may well be that if we are convinced in the rightness of a theory and how it applies to our own situation, it can liberate us to some degree from our own guilt and our own consternations. For example, I've noticed that a medical condition can dramatically improve if I receive a proper diagnosis that I can firmly believe is accurate. Clearly, the placebo effect is a powerful one across all fields, including those suffering from certain mental illnesses. Higher-order consciousness may provide a tremendous advantage for us to live within our heads before acting out our varying plans, but it can also boomerang against us, since we have a tendency to conflate our dreams with the world around. To the degree that our internal models help us navigate and survive, it is a tool of incalculable power. But to the degree that it binds us into mistakenly believing, without sufficient evidence, our own imaginings, we can become prisoners within its hallucinatory walls. The mind is a simulation operator and evolved to allow individuals to imagine and plan for events not yet occurring in the world we live and breathe in. As Michio Kaku, theoretical physicist at City College of New York, explains in his most recent book, The Future of the Mind, human consciousness is a specific form of consciousness that creates a model of the world and then simulates it in time by evaluating the past to simulate the future. This requires mediating and evaluating many feedback loops to make a decision to achieve a goal. It can be argued that we are all delusional to some extent, since many of our delusions, religious or otherwise, allow us to buffer ourselves from the stark reality that the planet we find ourselves foraging about is a death machine where no one gets out alive. Consciousness, as a virtual simulator, Edelman's second nature, may have evolved not only to help us with developing ways to strategize, but also to distract us from our precarious predicament. As my student once quipped to me, too much reality and we become catatonic, and too much fantasy and we become schizophrenic. Perhaps most importantly, certain aspects of the virtual simulator hypothesis have been tested and are garnering impressive results. New Scientist recently reported that thinking about a certain activity, such as juggling skills, before doing it could significantly improve one's ability later on. Sukley Liu and her colleagues from the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke in Bethesda, Maryland, asked 8 adults to watch a circle on a screen while an fMRI machine scanned their brain. When the circle turned into a triangle, the volunteers moved their fingers. This movement caused activity in their premotor cortex and supplementary motor cortex, brain areas involved in imaging moving and actually moving, which in turn raised a bar on the screen. The more synchronized the brain activity, the higher the bar went. More synchronization has previously been linked with better performance in movement tasks. The researchers then asked the volunteers to imagine performing a complicated action, whatever they liked, as long as it increased the height of the bar. This enabled them to develop a way of improving coordination between the brain regions using thought alone. After an hour of mental practice, participants were 10% faster at a manual task. Those who showed the greatest increase in speed also showed the greatest enhancement in synchronization. Interestingly, some neuropsychologists believe that our sense of a self developed after, not before, we evolved ways to envisage, via intentional stances, why others behaved the way they do. In other words, we became adept at projecting prior to becoming adept at reflecting. 6. Equivalent waves. I think the simplest reason that there are thousands of religions around the world is due to meaning equivalence, which is that any meaning is better than no meaning, provided such meaning makes one want to live an extra day. It is not really an issue of whether one religion is truer than another, or even that a particular religious system is simply made up, but rather that the believer finds something of value or solace in it. The fundamentalist Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, and Scientologist each have differing ideologies, but what they share in common is that they are each believers, and it is the act of believing, and not necessarily what is believed, that is the motivating force. This is a very obvious but nevertheless telling point that is too often obscured by a relentless focus on doctrinal differences and not on what is the same with all devotees without exception, the brain. The theory of meaning equivalence, ME for short, helps explain why even the most bizarre of creation myths can be accepted as true by otherwise very rational and level-headed disciples. For instance, in Eckankar's cosmology, it is believed that the true teachings were originated on the city of Retz on the planet Venus and transported to this planet some 6 million years ago by an ancient master named Gakko. Scientology goes a step further, and its founder, L. Ron Hubbard, for whom coincidentally Twitchell used to serve as a press agent, has an elaborate schema which claims that Xenu was the dictator of the Galactic Confederacy, who, 75 million years ago, brought billions of his people to Earth, then known as Tegeac, in a DC-8-like spacecraft, stacked them around volcanoes, and killed them with hydrogen bombs. Official Scientology scriptures hold that the thetans, immortal spirits of these aliens, adhere to humans, causing spiritual harm. However, new creation stories are not any more bizarre than old ones. Being brought up in the Roman Catholic Church, I was taught, almost from birth, that thousands of years ago, if not millions, there lived two humans named Adam and Eve, who displeased God by eating from the tree of knowledge, even though they were forbidden by him to do so. However, a closer reading of Genesis shows that there was also another tree in the Garden of Eden called the Tree of Everlasting Life, and because God feared that Adam and Eve, with their newfound knowledge, would soon discover its location and eat of its fruit and become like him, he cast them out of the garden and put a cherubim and a flame of fire to guard it, ostensibly, forever. What overall purpose do these narratives serve, particularly if one cannot verify their respective truth claims? They provide an overarching narrative in which to explain why the world is so perplexing and help position one's relative place within it. These are contextual stories that ultimately give one purpose in a cosmos that seems devoid of any. 7. Interrupting waves. However, reflecting before projecting, though it is a wondrous survival tool, carries an unforeseen downside. To the degree that I am freer than other animals to directionally ponder in my mind unimagined scenarios, it allows me to better adapt to unexpected future outcomes. But the same freedom also opens me to imagine my own cessation and those of others that I am attached to and love. A dog doesn't appear to meditate on how distant stars will die and transform into black holes, or how universes may appear and disappear over eons of time. Yet as humans with enlarged brains, we evolved to ponder all sorts of imponderables, and thus our Darwinian gift is also at times our Darwinian curse. This is precisely why I think a deeper understanding of how consciousness operates can, to some measure, liberate us from our second-nature nausea, to slightly bastardize a famous observation from Albert Camus. The seemingly most important questions we tend to ask, is there a God, do I have a soul, is there life after death, etc., only arise at certain moments in our awareness and completely subside at other moments. Indeed, within any normal 24-hour cycle, the issues we think that are so vital and so urgent only last for a set duration, only to disappear when deep sleep overwhelms us, and all such questions are forgotten until we awake again. In a sense, the questions we ask of the universe are really reflections of our state of awareness at any given stage, and therefore serve as telling signposts of what that particular state entails. The questions and their desired answers are of secondary importance when viewed in this cyclical light. What seems more elemental is to find out precisely why these pressing concerns bother us so much at 12 noon, but appear lifeless and without urgency at 12 midnight when we are fast asleep. The thesis is a very simple, if a profound one. We do not fear death in deep sleep, and we do not care if there is life after death, or if there is a God, or who we are. These issues only arise within a certain frame of consciousness, which itself is but a temporary state. Change the state, and you change the questions that appear to matter so much to us. Our day-to-day experiences are truly one of consciousness interruptus. We grog awake, we stay awake, we take naps, we space out, we grog to sleep, we dream, we fall into a deep slumber. And the process recycles. Depending on which cycle is operative, so too the questions we ask and ponder. We live in a temporal context, a self-referential trap, and hence our first error is that we confuse neurology, or our present state of awareness, with the absoluteness of all things, forgetting that our awareness is akin to frijoles saltarines, Mexican jumping beans, going from place to place but never stationary, never permanent. Just as waves modulate upon the sea, so do our moments of self rise and fall. I am in a strange loop, as Douglas Hofstadter rightly surmised in his book of the same title, but which he first introduced in Gödel, Escher, Bach, An Eternal Golden Braid. Depending on which state of awareness I find myself, the feedback circuits alternate, and so do my concerns. Most of the time when I am in the waking state, I am not doing philosophy, but instead focusing on a whole slew of bodily needs which demand my attention, from eating to drinking to showering, etc. And no one state remains constantly the same but fluctuates throughout the day and night, giving rise to a cascade of moods and feelings. Yet, each of these states of mind have their own temporary context, and instead of one permanent self throughout these changing proceedings, I find instead a multiplicity of mini-selves, each with their own unique perspectives, desires, and troubles. Yes, there is a part of me that attempts to stitch all these personas into a unified person I call myself, but this unconscious and sometimes conscious activity continually gets interrupted. At one moment I may be fearful about flying and what it portends, particularly if I learn about an airline tragedy, as happened these past few months with the disappearance of a Malaysian jet. At another instance, I don't care about anything else except the tasty lemonade I am sipping and the glistening sun shimmering off the trees in Idlewild. Perhaps our consciousness can be likened to surfing waves which, depending on their size and shape, we ride in different ways. A wave at Point Panic on the south shore of Oahu necessitates that I body surf it going right, with only fins on my feet as my hands plane through its bowling section. However, if I am surfing at the north side of Newport Pier in the dead of winter, I may opt for a 9-foot-long board, since on occasion I am forced to navigate the barnacled pilings to safely make my way to the other side. Or, if I am staying at La Jolla Shores and playing with my 2 kids and my wife, we may all use bodyboards and ride white water together until we land on dry sand. Each wave is different and therefore allows for different possibilities. Analogously, the same holds true for the undulating ripples of our own awareness. This is important because, quite simply, the context of consciousness shapes and contours the content of what arises and what necessitates our attention. The questions we ask of ourselves and of the multiverse at large are products of these changing patterns, whether they are environmentally cued or biochemically triggered. Thus, I have long noticed that whenever we are happy, very happy, at a particular juncture in life, we may also feel a certain anxiety, a certain fear that it may end. Yet, if we are deeply depressed or extremely ill, we don't worry as much, if at all, about death or non-existence. Therefore, our questions and worries are a priori predicated upon our wavering moods. Instead of getting trapped with our self-referential feedback loops, pondering conundrums that may never be resolved, it might be wise to introspect on why certain questions only emerge at certain times and not at others. In other words, instead of a continual stream of unanswered queries, we focus on why we are asking why in the first place, such as why I fear death only when I am relatively happy, but never when I am severely sick with stomach flu. The questions we ask have less to do with some ultimate truth, but more to do with our own neurological phases. This is telling, because if we could better understand the ground from which our varying forms of awareness arise, it may transform our reactions when these strange loops of awareness take shape. 8. Calming waves. Apparently, sages from both East and West realized the volatile nature of consciousness, and instead of being sabotaged by its manifold incarnations, sought to seek its phenomenal origins. Hence, the non-dual philosophy of Indian mystics, such as Shankara or Ramana Maharshi, becomes clearer when self-awareness is viewed in this light. The following question and answer sequence, transcribed live from a conversation between Ramana and a seeker at Arunachala, Talks with Sri Ramana Maharshi provides a glimpse into how such an enlightened insight can transfigure how we view ourselves and our surrounding cosmos. D. Should we not find out the ultimate reality of the world, individual, and God? M. These are all conceptions of the I. They arise only after the advent of the I thought. Did you think of them in your deep sleep? You existed in deep sleep, and the same you are now speaking. If they be real, should they not be in your sleep also? They are only dependent upon the I thought. Again, does this world tell you, I am the world? Does the body say, I am body? You say, this is the world, this is body, and so on. So these are only your conceptions. Find out who you are, and there will be an end of all your doubts. D. Being always being consciousness bliss, why does God place us in difficulties? Why did he create us? M. Does God come and tell you that he has placed you in difficulties? It is you who say so. It is again the wrong I. If that disappears, there will be no one to say that God created this or that. That which is does not even say, I am. For does any doubt rise, I am not? Only in such a case should one be reminding oneself, I am a man. One does not. On the other hand, if a doubt arises whether he is a cow or a buffalo, he has to remind himself that he is not a cow, etc. But I am a man. This would never happen. Similarly with one's own existence and realization. Another from the group asked, how is the ego to be destroyed? M. If you seek the ego, you will find it does not exist. That is the way to destroy it. M. Hold the ego first, and then ask how it is to be destroyed. Who asks this question? It is the ego. Can the ego ever agree to kill itself? This question is a sure way to cherish the ego and not to kill it. If you seek the ego, you will find it does not exist. That is the way to destroy it. In this connection, I am often reminded of a funny incident which took place when I was living in the West Chitre Street in Madura. A neighbor in an adjoining house anticipated the visit of a thief to his house. He took precautions to catch him. He posted policemen in mufti to guard the two ends of the lane, the entrance and the back door to his own house. The thief came as expected, and the men rushed to catch him. He took in the situation at a glance and shouted, hold him, there, he runs there, there." Saying so, he made good his escape. D. So it is with the ego. Look for it, and it will not be found. That is the way to get rid of it. M. Who is this witness? You speak of witness. There must be an object and a subject to witness. These are creations of the mind. The idea of witness is in the mind. If there was the witness of oblivion, did he say, I witness oblivion? You, with your mind, said just now that there must be a witness. Who was the witness? You must reply, I. Who is that I again? You are identifying yourself with the ego and say, I. Is this ego I, the witness? It is the mind that speaks. It cannot be witness of itself. With self-imposed limitations you think that there is a witness of mind and of oblivion. You also say, I am the witness. That one who witnesses the oblivion must say, I witness oblivion. The present mind cannot arrogate to itself that position. The whole position becomes thus untenable. Consciousness is unlimited. On becoming limited, it simply arrogates to itself the position. There is really nothing to witness. It is simple being. Sam Harris, in a recent interview, Taming the Mind with Dan Harris of ABC's Nightline, apparently not related, gave a pregnant explanation of why meditation accomplishes, or doesn't accomplish, by focusing on the illusion of a self. The same is true for the illusoriness of the self. Consciousness is already free of the feeling that we call I. However, a person must change his plane of focus to realize this. Some practices can facilitate this shift in awareness, but there is no truly gradual path that leads there. Many long-time meditators seem completely unaware that these two planes of focus exist, and they spend their lives looking out the window, as it were. I used to be one of them. I'd stay on retreat for a few weeks or months at a time, being mindful of the breath and other sense objects, thinking that if I just got closer to the raw idea of experience, a breakthrough would occur. Occasionally, a breakthrough did occur. In a moment of seeing, for instance, there would be pure seeing, and consciousness would appear momentarily free of any feeling to which the notion of a self could be attached. But then the experience would fade, and I couldn't get back there at will. There was nothing to do but return to meditating dualistically on contents of consciousness, with self-transcendence as a distant goal. However, from the non-dual side, ordinary consciousness, the very awareness that you and I are experiencing in this conversation, is already free of self, and this can be pointed out directly and recognized again and again as one's only form of practice. So, gradual approaches are, almost by definition, misleading, and yet this is where everyone starts. In criticizing this kind of practice, someone like Eckhart Tolle is echoing the non-dualistic teachings one finds in traditions such as Advaita Vedanta, Zen sometimes, and Dzogchen. Many of these teachings can sound paradoxical. You can't get there from here. The self that you think you are isn't going to meditate itself into a new condition. This is true, but as Sharon says, it's not always useful. The path is too steep. Of course, this non-dual teaching too can be misleading, because even after one recognizes the intrinsic selflessness of consciousness, one still has to practice that recognition. So there is a point to meditation after all, but it isn't a goal-oriented one. In each moment of real meditation, the self is already transcended. The virtual simulator theory of consciousness basically suggests that there is no absolute, concrete self as such, but rather a kaleidoscope of enveloping simulations which provide us with an almost infinite array of stratagems for future orientations or past musings for what was or could have been. Rarely do we ever experience the space prior or between such mental facsimiles. Yet this very ground of being is always present and never absent from any phrenic permutations, just as in movies which may change nightly, whereas the projector and the screen upon which they are projected remain constant. Realizing that consciousness unfolds in this sequential manner, with dreaming being the most illustrative example of how a virtual simulator operates, it provides us with a bridge with which to better appreciate existential sorrow. This is what meditation can unlock: direct insight into how the mind constantly seduces us into believing its conjurings to be the sum total of reality. Yes, it is indeed sad, but only during a very specific stage in awareness. Such sadness doesn't arise in us when we are fast asleep, or when we are sipping on a classic Coke and not thinking about much of anything except that next bite of hot pretzel dipped in mustard. This is not to dismiss our continual observations about meaninglessness, because we all share, more or less, that same sense of dread at certain points, but to dig deeper and find out in what specific contexts do our individuated selves loom so large as to bring such angst into the forefront of our attention. This is what meditation can unlock: direct insight into how the mind constantly seduces us into believing its conjurings to be the sum total of reality, when, in point of observation, they are merely mapping transparencies evolved over long gestations of time to help second-nature organisms better survive and adapt. Look to the source of where such forms of consciousness emerge and follow how long these temporary aberrations persist, and the Ferris wheel nature of self-reflective awareness becomes all too obvious. We may not be able to stop our mind from its simulating habits, After all, developing such a turnstile of past and future ruminations is of great evolutionary advantage to us. But if we can remain a witness and not a prisoner to its concealing allurements, then we can be liberated from its more negative consequences. In this way, we can better enjoy the firework display of consciousness because we are keenly cognizant of its ephemeral nature and purpose. Of course, this doesn't mean that by our Ramana-like inquiries or meditations we have somehow solved the riddle of existence and forever ended the samsara of pain, which inevitably arises within the human condition, but it does provide a profound pathway to alleviate much of the unnecessary sufferings we experience, because we have conflated our current brain state for the real state of the universe. The noted mathematician Benjamin Elliott brilliantly captured the essence of the virtual simulator and its machine-like ability to churn over unsolved mysteries when he wrote, "Well, it's Friday night, and I think I'll indulge my frequent Friday night habit of spacing out with some wine cooler and cheese doodles while I listen to some very old-fashioned show music from the 1950s on my record player. But while I'm doing this, my subconscious will be hard at work, pondering if there could possibly be any meaning or purpose to the universe. And if I come up with any creative insights, I'll be sure to let you know." The good news here is that, as Ramana Maharshi and other Advaita Vedantists may be quick to point out, much later in the night when we are all in a dreamless sleep, we will remain blissfully unaware not only of this world and ourselves, but also of worries about meaning and death and the purpose of it all. As Plato opined, via the mouthpiece of Socrates, centuries ago in his Apology, "Now, if you suppose that there is no consciousness, but a sleep like the sleep of him who is undisturbed even by dreams, death will be an unspeakable gain." The secret is to understand that the questions that mean so much to us when fully awake, and which serve as relative thermometers of our own well-being, lose all their compelling force when we enter a different region of awareness. Awaken to this evidential truth, and the existential questions that have driven humankind near the brink of madness since time immemorial melt away like ice in an unremitting desert sun. Do not be attached to phantasms of light and sound and the magical universes they create, but ask a deeper question. Who is it that sees this light within? Who is it that hears the inner sound? Find the source from where such light and sound flows forth. Find the source of why so many questions arise from this I thought. That source is our real being. Baba Fakir Chand. Free translation from a personal letter dated 1980. Kaku's space-time theory of consciousness and Edelman's two-nature understanding of awareness are helpful theoretic orientations for us to better understand how and why meditation works. Meditation involves many levels of deployment. Primarily, it is concerned with bringing our attention back to the present moment and becoming aware of what is happening here and now. In order to do this, one builds a bridge between second and first nature so that one can let go of consuming revelries and become attuned with the current locality. This is more difficult than one might suspect, since our brains evolved to disengage and imagine all sorts of scenarios that don't need our immediate scrutiny. If we watch how our mind functions moment to moment, we can see how easily we fluctuate about from paying attention to what is constantly changing in our field of sight, sound, and touch, boarding an airplane, say, to daydreaming about what we are going to do with our eventual careers, sitting in a classroom during a boring lecture, for instance. Our awareness is akin to a wild animal that doesn't settle too long at any one place. This monkey mind never really rests, not even in sleep, and dissipates energy in this continual process. Getting the mind to settle down isn't an easy thing to do. But once accomplished, even if only in degrees, it not only energizes one's being, but also offers a pathway to experience hitherto neglected aspects of awareness. First and second nature are waves of a much deeper and broader body of consciousness. The process of meditating is to follow the source from which our awareness originally arises and to witness how it both presages and transcends the waking and dream states that we are so familiar with. Speaking from my own experience, I can say without any reservations that there are some wonderful benefits to the internal quest, not the least of which are deeper insights into how the mind actually works, and a widening sense of bliss the more one plunges deeper into awareness itself. Of course, we have to be careful over how we interpret what we discover on our inner journeys. As humans, we seem to have an almost genetic predisposition to conflate our brain state with the real state of the universe and wax hyperbolic about our latest enlightenments. Far too often, religion or other ideologies attempt to hijack our inner experiences and intertwine them with their own theological agendas, prematurely blinding us from keeping open-minded to alternative explanations. The common denominator in all meditative practices, whether Buddhist or Christian or secular humanist, is the human brain, which, thankfully, isn't tied down to any ism or geographical region. 9. Information waves. The larger question that arises, and one that is fraught with a bevy of implications, is whether our form of consciousness is the result of physical complexity or is rather distinct from our body-brain medium. More precisely, is consciousness like an ocean wave that is an energetic pattern that moves through physical space and time and which is discernible as a unique form of information? Or is consciousness something that is ontologically resistant to a set of physical laws and rules and thus cannot be defined within the known parameters of physics or our current scientific paradigms? I have noticed that there are strong advocates on both sides, and there is tremendous friction between these camps and what they ultimately believe. But I think the very way we tend to frame this either-or scenario to consciousness is in itself more telling about our own neural limitations and the evolutionary pressures that produced a brain that would categorize the issue in such a light. A common non-physicalist perspective on self-reflective awareness is that it should not be conflated within the boundaries of our body, but should be likened to a song that plays through a radio, but is not part and parcel of it. Yet, as pregnant as this analogy may be, it only begs the ultimate question it tries to temporarily resolve by placing it far away from its putative origin. Given this metaphorical sleight of hand, the question merely gets codified into what then is consciousness, and how and why does it need such a moderating medium in order to be displayed in this world? Or, from a more skeptical perspective, why is the experience of consciousness so fragile that it depends on the ebb and flow of tiny chemicals such as adenosine? Arguably, the key question that needs to be answered in our quest to understand consciousness is whether our self-reflective awareness can be algorithmically understood in terms of information theory, and thus is potentially substrate neutral, or is, as Sir Roger Penrose has long argued, the result of quantum biological processes which cannot in principle be computationally reduced. In the early 1960s, Dean E. Woolridge, a research associate at California Institute of Technology and a director of TRW, laid out in his now prophetic book, Mechanical Man, The Physical Basis of Intelligent Life, strongly posited that if the properties of consciousness can indeed be shown to be precisely determined in rigid cause and effect fashion by the physical state of the associated material, then conscious phenomena clearly belong to the subject matter of basic science. The unusual properties of consciousness which make it seem so different from quantities which we think we understand better do not disqualify it for inclusion. Indeed, if concepts had in the past been excluded from physics when they seemed too bizarre or hard to comprehend, there would certainly be no relativity or quantum mechanics today. As such, we are finally ready to make the same transition from metaphysics to physics that was set in motion for the other functions of the body in the early 1600s. It was not so long ago that many people, including some very eminent thinkers, such as Henri Bergson, believed that the secrets of genetics would never be revealed by biochemistry because there was something inherently non-reducible in life's coding system, perhaps reminiscent of supernatural vitalism. But this turned out to be spectacularly wrong when Francis Crick and James Watson discovered the double helix structure to DNA and how 4 basic building blocks, adenine, cytosine, thymine, and guanine, comprise the fundamental language in life's evolution. It is the reconfiguration of these letters as base pairs AT and CG which make up our genotypes and which in turn determine the elementary differences between a dolphin, a human, and a grain of rice. What may have seemed unimaginable in the early 20th century, unraveling the billions of lines of code of a human genome, is now viewed as relatively commonplace. Is it conceivable that the mystery of consciousness may also have an informational solution similar to the genomic revolution? Christoph Koch and Giulio Tononi believe that integrated information theory is the key to finally understanding how consciousness arises from complex chunks of matter. In this view, even though self-awareness is constructed from immensely varied but connected data streams, what we experience in our consciousness is integrated, and thus differentiated parts come to us in a qualia gestalt. Hypothetically, this means that the amount of information that any system can compute at any given time is correlated to a conscious state. As such, this indicates that even though reductionism can indeed unpack the varying incoming data waves, the subjective experience of consciousness is experienced as a whole, and thus cannot be properly understood unless that totality is taken as a given. Another way of understanding this is that qualia may consist of any number of subroutines that contribute to its subjective character, but it is when those pathways conjoin which leads to an integrated sense of consciousness. Neuroscientist Giulio Tononi's PHI, A Voyage from the Brain to the Soul, summarizes it this way. Integrated information measures how much can be distinguished by the whole above and beyond its parts, and F is its symbol. A complex is where F reaches its maximum, and therein lives one consciousness, a single entity of experience. However, Koch's and Tononi's integrated theory shouldn't be conflated with Ken Wilber's integral theory, since the former doesn't invoke a spirit or consciousness first principle, but rather focuses on how material complexity, the totality of specific informational patterns, is coincident with self-reflective awareness. As Koch illuminates, it's not that any physical system has consciousness. A black hole, a heap of sand, a bunch of isolated neurons in a dish, they're not integrated. They have no consciousness. But complex systems do. And how much consciousness they have depends on how many connections they have and how they're wired up. Though this may at first glance appear to advocate a top-down approach, it is more properly adjudicated as an informational scaffolding project, where very close attention is given to neural complexity and the vast material interconnections necessary that gives rise to varying levels of consciousness. Thus it is the level of integration, not necessarily the compositional strata of that integration, that gives rise to awareness. This then suggests that consciousness is substrate neutral, which means that all sorts of non-organic material could potentially reflect consciousness, including the Internet. As Koch controversially admits, But according to my version of panpsychism, it feels like something to be the internet, and if the internet were down, it wouldn't feel like anything anymore. And that is, in principle, not different from the way I feel when I'm in a deep, dreamless sleep. John Searle, who has been a professor of philosophy at UC Berkeley for more than 5 decades and is famous for his contrarian views on how consciousness should be studied, finds Koch's panpsychism to be unpalatable. In a scathing critique in the New York Review of Books, Searle writes, "But the deepest objection is that the theory is unmotivated. Suppose they could give a definition of integrated and differentiated information that was not observer-relative, that would enable us to tell from the brute physics of a system whether it had such information and what information exactly it had. Why should such systems thereby have qualitative, unified subjectivity? In addition to bearing information as so defined, why should there be something it feels like to be a photodiode, a photon, a neutron, a smartphone, embedded processor, personal computer, the air we breathe, the soil we tread on, or any other wonderful examples? As it stands, the theory does not seem to be a serious scientific proposal." Both Koch and Tononi, however, argue that their theory is open to scientific refutation and thus qualifies as a serious scientific endeavor, contrary to Searle's doubts. In a recent issue of Wired magazine, Koch was asked, "Is your version of panpsychism truly scientific rather than metaphysical? How can it be tested?" To which Koch responded, "In principle, in all sorts of ways. One implication is that you can build 2 systems, each with the same input and output, but one, because of its internal structure, has integrated information. One system would be conscious and the other not. It's not the input-output behavior that makes a system conscious, but rather the internal wiring. The theory also says you can have simple systems that are conscious and complex systems that are not. The cerebellum should not give rise to consciousness because of the simplicity of its connections. Theoretically, you can compute that and see if that's the case, though we can't do that right now. There are millions of details we still don't know. Human brain imaging is too crude. It doesn't get you to the cellular level. The more relevant question to me as a scientist is, how can I disprove the theory today? That's more difficult. Tononi's group has built a device to perturb the brain and assess the extent to which severely brain-injured patients, think of Terry Schiavo, are truly unconscious, or whether they do feel pain and distress but are unable to communicate to their loved ones. And it may be possible that some other theories of consciousness would fit these facts. Interestingly, and perhaps more revealing than one might at first suspect, the integrated informational approach has parallels, at least in part, with genomics and how complex DNA strands, when properly sequenced, give rise to organic life. As J. Craig Venter brilliantly illustrates in his latest book, Life at the Speed of Light, life is an information system, and only when each part of that code is properly aligned can an organic cell properly function. Even the tiniest of errors, where just one nucleotide is misplaced, can have catastrophic consequences, as Venter explained when trying to synthesize the M. mycoides genome. Having established which segment contained an error or errors that did not support life, we sequenced the DNA once again, this time using the highly accurate Sanger sequencing method, and found that there was a single base pair deletion. If this sounds as trivial as writing MISTKE instead of mistake, equating nucleotides to individual letters is slightly misleading in the sense that DNA code is read 3 nucleotides at a time, so that each 3-base combination or codon corresponds to a single amino acid in a protein. This means that a single base deletion effectively shifts the rest of a genetic sentence that follows, and hence the sequence of amino acids that the sentence codes for. This is called a frame shift mutation, In this case, the frame shift occurred in the essential gene DNA-A, which promotes the unwinding of DNA at the replication origin so that replication can begin, allowing a new genome to be made. That single base deletion prevented cell division and thus made life impossible. Is consciousness as an informational coding system, defined by its integrated sets of computational interactions, similar to genomics, where the real emphasis must be on how individual parts, be it neurons or nucleotides, combine and reconfigure to give birth to integrated complexes, be it a living cell or a conscious entity. Interestingly, Venter and his scientific team have discovered by their painstaking and labor-intensive efforts that life itself may also be substrate neutral, since they have successfully created the first synthetic life form. This breakthrough was only possible, though, by using sophisticated computer technology in order to digitally map out the complex coding inherent in tiny cells with simpler genomes, such as the 582,970 base pair M. genitalium. Of course, Venter and his team would never have even started, much less succeeded in their experiments, unless Watson and Crick had first unraveled the double helix structure to deoxyribonucleic acid, the basic building block to all life as we know it on this planet. Hence, even the most integrated of circuits must first be understood by unmasking its most fundamental of parts. This holds true whether one is compiling the Oxford English Dictionary, with its 26 letters from A to Z, developing the rudiments of computer processing, resting as it does on a binary number system, or making a wood-fired pizza, dependent as it is on a preconceived list of ingredients. Thus, and contrary to popular misconceptions, the informational approach, whether in genetics or neuroscience, evolves out of reductionism, not in juxtaposition with it, and should not be conflated with vitalism or metaphysics. As Venter explains, DNA was the software of life, and if we changed that software, we changed the species, and thus the hardware of the cell. This is precisely the result that those yearning for evidence of some vitalistic force feared would come out of good reductionist science, of trying to break down life and what it meant to be alive into basic functions and simple components. Our experiments did not leave much room to support the views of the vitalists or of those who want to believe life depends on something more than a complex composite of chemical reactions. Likewise, Christoph Koch, who worked for years with Francis Crick on consciousness, Crick in 1994 dedicated his ultimate reductionist manifesto, The Astonishing Hypothesis, to Koch, and who was for many years a professor of biology at Caltech, hasn't abandoned reductionism simply because he strongly believes in Tononi's phi and the way of integrated information. To the contrary, Koch recently resigned from Caltech to take up his current position as Chief Scientific Officer of the Allen Institute for Brain Science in Seattle, Washington, where, among other projects, he focuses on studying the neural correlates necessary for human consciousness. A cursory survey of the Institute's sponsored publications should assuage any fears one may have that a phi approach is incompatible with intertheoretic reductionism. It should also be noted that information theory, besides now being elemental in genomics and neuroscience, is also championed by physicists as a fundamental way of understanding the quantum universe. As Seth Lloyd explained in his now classic tome, Programming the Universe is made of bits. Every molecule, atom, and elementary particle registers bits of information. Every interaction between those pieces of the universe processes that information by altering those bits. That is, the universe computes, and because the universe is governed by the laws of quantum mechanics, it computes in an intrinsically quantum mechanical fashion. Its bits are quantum bits. The history of the universe is, in effect, a huge and ongoing quantum computation. The universe is a quantum computer. If such is true, then what we are witnessing in differing scientific disciplines is how varying levels of computation or information processing evolve over time into sophisticated, complex systems, ranging from the elements in the periodic table to mutating viruses and bacteria to self-conscious animals, to artificial intelligence guided by digital software. The implications of this underlying informational approach, however, are mind-boggling, to say the least. What this portends is a holistic way of understanding matter and mind, not by appealing to mythic animism, but rather by studying how intersecting bits of information cohere and create replicating forms of intelligent organisms. Or, to put it more precisely, reductionism and integration are not dueling alternatives, but rather complementary pathways that necessitate each other. The implications of this underlying informational approach, however, are mind-boggling, to say the least. In genomics, Craig Venter predicts that in the future we will be able to transfer a complete digital blueprint via biological teleportation. When we read the genetic code by sequencing a genome, we are converting the physical code of DNA into a digital code that can be transformed into an electromagnetic wave that can be transmitted at the speed of light. The day is not far off when we will be able to send a robotically controlled genome sequencing unit in a probe to other planets to read the DNA sequence of any alien microbe life that may be there, whether it is living or preserved. Already, Craig Venter has had his own genome sequenced and broadcast into space. This was only made possible because of the unique configuration of his DNA, which could be translated into a digital record. Because Venter's genotype sequencing as such was substrate neutral, it allowed for a binary informational upload. If evolving forms of consciousness, like all biological phenotypes, has an informational blueprint of its own, then it too can be uploaded and transferred digitally, provided that it is ultimately computational. In this scenario, self-reflective awareness is ultimately but one aspect of integrated information processing. This indicates that there can and must be a wide spectrum of differing internal states that correlate with complex chunks of matter, be it biological or digital. This is what is meant by consciousness being substrate neutral. As Koch elaborates, we live in a universe where organized bits of matter give rise to consciousness, and with that we can ultimately derive all sorts of interesting things. The answer to when a fetus or a baby first becomes conscious, whether a brain-injured patient is conscious, pathologies of consciousness such as schizophrenia, or consciousness in animals. We may also be able in the future to do precisely what Ray Kurzweil and other futurists have long prophesied, which is to reverse engineer the human brain and then transfer that information algorithmically into electromagnetic waves with the possibility of reconstructing it into different mediums, which are not as biologically brittle as the human body. Nevertheless, Sir Roger Penrose argues that consciousness may be the result of quantum properties and as such cannot ad hoc be reduced computationally, since there are non-algorithmic features inherent in the subatomic world. Others, such as the Nobel Prize-winning neurophysiologist Sir John Eccles, believed that the mind or soul was something quite distinct from the brain that housed it. As he stridently argued in Evolution of the Brain, Creation of the Self, I maintain that the human mystery is incredibly demeaned by scientific reductionism, with its claim in promissory materialism to account eventually for all of the spiritual world in terms of patterns of neuronal activity. This belief must be classed as a superstition. We have to recognize that we are spiritual beings with souls existing in a spiritual world, as well as material beings with bodies and brains existing in a material world. Yet, Haeckel's dualism has tended to be ignored by the general scientific community as a non-starter, since a soul theory, by definition, is metaphysical and not readily amenable to confirmation or refutation. As Patricia Smith Churchland argued in her recent book, Touching a Nerve, "Back to my wisdom tooth. Can the dualist match neuroscience's level of explanatory consilience regarding why procaine blocks pain? Not even close. A dualist could say, well, the procaine also acts on the soul. But how, even roughly, does that work? What does it do to the soul? Especially if procaine is physical and the soul completely not physical." This dualist says nothing at all about mechanism. Consider the contrast with the neuronal explanation, which is all about mechanism. What is perhaps most exciting today about the scientific quest to understand consciousness is that so many avenues, even if contradictory, have opened up and been championed in various quarters, whereas, in the past, the subjective nature of human awareness was regarded as more or less a Skinnerian black box. Isaac Asimov, not surprisingly given his prophetic track record with regard to most things scientific, captured the essence of informational theory when he analogized that selfhood was akin to a sand castle on a beach. Yes, it is made of tiny grains of sand, but the architecture cannot be reduced to just one bit, since it is the totality of how those bits are compiled that makes all the difference. Alter those grains and you can construct a moat. Alter them yet again, and you can reproduce a tower or an underground tunnel. Similarly, the self is the result of a vast network of intersecting bits of matter, including neurons, synapses, dendrites, axons, and chemical electrical fluid, etc. Without those integrated neuronal switches, human consciousness as we presently know it doesn't manifest, just as the sandcastle doesn't appear without its constituent parts being intact. However, if consciousness, like its sand counterpart, is, in terms of informational processing, substrate neutral, then one could, if he or she so desires, reverse engineer its coordinates and complex intersections and reconstruct it anew in an entirely different medium, provided such reconstructions were digitally accurate. We have already seen what this new, brave new world of information processing has done and will continue to do in the world of genomics. Since we have already created synthetic cells based on DNA coding, one can only wonder if, in the not-so-distant future, whether scientists will be able to construct a truly synthetic self. As Seth Lloyd concludes about the universe at large, the primary consequence of the computational nature of the universe is that the universe naturally generates complex systems such as life. Although the basic laws of physics are comparatively simple in form, they give rise, because they are computationally universal, to systems of enormous complexity. Fitting with the guiding metaphor of this article, it may be useful to think of the brain as a relatively stable haven for waves of incoming and outgoing streams of information, primarily orchestrated to keep our precarious organism alive long enough to make a copy of itself. Our very thoughts are probably simulations evolved to ruminate over the past so as to better adapt to the present ecosystem and to project far into the future unforeseen scenarios of danger and desire. If we understand that self-reflective awareness evolved as a survival tool and not necessarily as an unadulterated prism to view the cosmos as it is, then it would be wise to be grounded in biological neuroscience so as not to be naive about what our internal mystic sojourns ultimately mean. 10. Future waves. Yet, what is it that makes the subject of consciousness recalcitrant to a completely satisfactory explanation, particularly when science has been so successful in explaining such vagaries as the process of genetics and the formation of galaxies? Perhaps the Mobius strip is a useful, albeit limited, metaphor here to invoke, since its unusual properties on first sight boggle the mind. A surface with only one side and only one boundary component. It has the mathematical property of being non-orientable. Analogously, the difficulty we have with studying consciousness is precisely that we cannot communicate what it is without losing the very quality that makes it such. Imagine that you wanted to convey what it was like to dream to someone who never dreamt and only had access to a waking state. How could you communicate dreaming without dreaming itself? Sam Harris, author of the recently well-received book Waking Up, suggests strongly that you cannot, and that any attempt to circumvent the obvious is simply unintelligible. How can one convey something that is non-orientable to that which is only orientable, if one has to forego the very thing that would communicate it? Isn't the breakdown of consciousness, which is strategically speaking the reductionist paradigm of Francis Crick, Churchland, and others, precisely the problem, since it breaks apart the very thing that must be experienced as a gestalt? Consciousness isn't a thing to be described among other things, since it is the context, not the content, of what is experienced. The Mobius strip is, by definition, an endless surface, and any attempt to reorient it, by definition again, transforms it into that which it is not. Isn't consciousness akin to this very definitional paradox? My very attempt to correlate it, or analogize it, or reduce it, or explain it, simply appends a genuine understanding of what it is to experience it, since consciousness isn't a thing to be described among other things, since it is the context, not the content, of what is experienced. More precisely, consciousness cannot be exported as a piece of content, since it is a whole context in which such appearances arise. My attempts to reduce that holism to parts ipso facto means that whatever follows will be irretrievably lost in translation. If I understand Sam Harris correctly, I think this is what he is driving at when he writes, "The problem, however, is that the distance between unconsciousness and consciousness must be traversed in a single stride, if traversed at all. Just as the appearance of something out of nothing cannot be explained by our saying that the first something was very small, the birth of consciousness is rendered no less mysterious by saying that the simplest minds have only a glimmer of it." Or, in more paradoxical but illuminating phrasing, Harris contends that we are merely deluding ourselves if we think we have solved the mystery of consciousness by our sleight-of-hand language shuffling. Harris writes, "Likewise, the idea that consciousness is identical to or emerged from unconscious physical events is, I would argue, impossible to properly conceive, which is to say that we can think we are thinking it, but we are mistaken. We can say the right words, of course. Consciousness emerges from unconscious information processing. We can also say some squares are as round as circles and 2 + 2 = 7. But are we really thinking these things all the way through? I don't think so. Consciousness, the sheer fact that the universe is illuminated by sentience, is precisely what unconsciousness is not. And I believe that no description of unconscious complexity will fully account for it. It seems to me that just as something and nothing, however juxtaposed, can do no explanatory work, an analysis of purely physical processes will never yield a picture of consciousness. However, this is not to say that some other thesis about consciousness must be true. Consciousness may very well be the lawful product of unconscious information processing. But I don't know what that sentence means, and I don't think anyone else does either. Tellingly, when Sam Harris attempted to convey such a sentiment to Daniel Dennett, the third or is that the second atheistic horseman? The latter bemusingly responded that, "If I can't imagine the falsehood of the above statement, I'm not trying hard enough." However, on a question as rudimentary as the ontology of consciousness, the debate often comes down to irreconcilable intuitions. At a certain point, one has to admit that one cannot understand what one's opponents are talking about. Perhaps Wittgenstein should make an entrance here and suggest that the real difficulty in studying consciousness is a language issue, and that some things simply cannot be addressed by our symbolical logical systems. Was Wittgenstein providing us with a prescient warning shot on studying self-reflective awareness when he concluded his 1919 Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus with, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent"? Or was Sir Arthur Eddington echoing a similar observation when he wrote, "All through the physical world runs that unknown content, which must surely be the study of our consciousness"? Here is a hint of aspects deep within the world of physics, and yet unattainable by the methods of physics. And, moreover, we have found that where science has progressed the farthest, the mind has but regained from nature that which the mind has put into nature. We have found a strange footprint on the shores of the unknown. We have devised profound theories, one after another, to account for its origin. At last we have succeeded in reconstructing the creature that made the footprint, and lo, it is our own. Perhaps the study of consciousness has an inherent limitation, similar in import to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle in quantum mechanics, or Gödel's incompleteness theorem in mathematics. Perhaps we are like seasoned travelers on a Mobius strip in quest of the other side of the band, who, after long and arduous circular travels, come to realize that no matter what route we take, we will always only be touching the same surface. If this is so, then a specialized version of Niels Bohr's complementarity may be an instructive insight for us as we venture forth. In any given situation, the use of certain classical concepts excludes the simultaneous meaningful application of other classical concepts. In the study of consciousness, it appears we may have to confront an epistemological complementarity where any objective study via third-person analysis of qualia must by necessity lose in translation a fundamental feature of the very phenomenon under inspection. Conversely, any purely subjective endeavor to explore consciousness must by its very act forego any attempt to maximally objectify what is experienced, lest the experience itself be lost in attempting to exteriorize that which is de facto interior. To mistake a wave and what it brings forth with the totality of the ocean is like confusing a state of awareness and its implications with the ultimate reality of all that exists. A broken-down melody is, to quote one distinguished musician, no longer a melody. Similarly, a broken-down consciousness is no longer itself, and therein lies the present conundrum in consciousness studies. My own hunch is that the most fruitful avenue for the scientific study of awareness is to fully exhaust a physical explanation of it first. This does not mean, of course, that such an endeavor will be successful or that consciousness is merely the result of a neural net, but only that, if our efforts fail, we will be left with a most interesting remainder, which in itself will be highly instructive about the nature of self-reflective awareness. More precisely, unless we fully option a materialist approach, we run the very real risk of prematurely championing something as spiritual when, in fact, given better instrumentation and technical prowess, it may well have been the result of subtle neuronal discharges. I don't say this lightly, as I know from my own personal experience how increasingly advanced diagnostic methods can unearth hitherto hidden physical variables. To flesh this out in a more graphic, if slightly hyperbolic example, I am reminded of an incident that happened to me last year when I was riding my electric skateboard. As I was entering Mother's Beach, a park adjacent to where I live in Huntington Harbour, I tried to ride my board over a little bump, only to find myself falling off and landing on my left elbow directly on the concrete sidewalk. I immediately knew something was wrong, as I couldn't move my arm even a couple of inches, so naturally I went to the doctor, who ordered an X-ray, but the film didn't reveal anything broken. However, he suggested that the X-ray might have missed something, so he encouraged me to have an MRI, which I thankfully did, since it turned out that I did indeed have a broken elbow. I was out of surfing and skateboarding commission for 8 weeks after that. I bring this example up because I think it serves as a good analogy for why it is important not to dismiss too early the viable idea that our awareness may be products of our own neuroanatomy. The brain is the most complex structure we have uncovered in the universe so far, and neuroscience is still in its infancy in understanding precisely how its various neural components work and interact. As such, the brain consists of extremely subtle and intricate pathways that have yet to be completely understood. If a broken elbow can go undetected by an X-ray, but can later show up with a more sophisticated MRI scan, it gives one pause about how much more we will understand about the brain when our technology exponentially advances, so we may unlock hitherto unknown lines of communication. This is not to say a priori, though, that consciousness is merely brain-generated, but that we should be exceptionally cautious before succumbing to what Paul Kurtz rightly called the transcendental temptation, whereby in our desire to support a mystical worldview, we carelessly and hurriedly forego a more rationalist and grounded approach. The good news in championing intertheoretic reductionism is that if our self-reflective awareness is ultimately non-physical, then our science will end up driving itself to the very brink of an epistemological cul-de-sac, and in the process reveal that which cannot be explained away. In this way, we should always keep an open mind to new data, even if we should also be highly skeptical at the same turn. The materialist agenda, I suggest, should be fully embraced by those most engaged in a spiritual quest, since it is, ironically, the surest pathway to discover that which is immune to our rational inspections. This has been the Library of Consciousness, Exploring Evolutionary Epistemology, written by Andrea Diem Lane and David Lane. Narrated by Jason Zenobia. Copyright 2014-2017 by David Christopher Lane. Production copyright 2018 by David Christopher Lane.